Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Abolitionism, a Very Short Introduction by Richard S. Newman. Narrated by Janina Edwards. Introduction. Abolitionist Agitation in a World of Slavery and Pain. A few years before he died, in 1895, the great African-American leader, Frederick Douglass, predicted that it would take a very long time for the world to appreciate the abolitionist movement. An escaped slave who played every conceivable role in the abolitionist struggle: editor, orator, organizer, political strategist, Underground Railroad operative, and military recruiter during the Civil War. Douglass knew that abolition played a key role in destroying Atlantic slavery, the most powerful economic and political institution of early modern society. Indeed, without abolitionist activism, slavery might well have survived into the 20th century. Were Douglass to return today, he would be glad to learn that abolitionists, slave rebels, and race reformers are celebrated in gleaming TV documentaries and award-winning books. Not since the 19th century have abolitionists been so visible. Of course, Douglass would be troubled by the persistence of racism. Like many reformers, Douglass believed that abolitionism was a dual movement, one aimed at destroying both bondage and racial prejudice. Moreover, he understood that abolition was a global movement of reformers trying to navigate the color line as would-be equals. Seeing everything from educational inequality to the alarming rise in black incarceration in contemporary America, Douglass would be sad that abolitionism remains an unfinished movement. But he would not sit idly by. In fact, Douglass would say one simple thing: keep fighting. If there is no struggle, there is no progress, he proclaimed in 1857 at the height of sectional debates over slavery. People who wanted to see freedom and justice reign, but did not agitate, he continued, want crops without plowing. For Douglass and countless others, activism was the keynote to abolitionism. Whether they were Caribbean slave rebels or pacifist preachers in the U.S. North, abolitionists constantly fought for slavery's destruction and a new brand of human equality. We live in a world they helped make. An imperfect one, to be sure, but a very different one from that which they inherited. This book offers a brief survey of abolitionism. While I focus mostly on Anglo-American reformers in the 18th and 19th centuries, the book surveys Atlantic-wide movements that began with slave rebels in the 1500s and ended with Brazilian emancipation in the 1880s. Wherever it took shape, abolitionism was both a meditation and a movement. A meditation on big ideas about freedom and equality, and a complex movement of people, organizations, and events designed to bring those ideas to fruition. While scholars have learned much about slavery and freedom during the past several decades, they have often veered away from seeing abolitionism as a social movement, an activist struggle akin to the civil rights movement in the 20th century. Douglass knew better. As he noted again and again, abolitionism was about agitation. As listeners will hear, I view abolitionists as agitators and change agents, not merely moralists and pious perfectionists. In an era charged by Black Lives Matter, environmental justice struggles, and #MeToo, the story of abolitionist agitation remains highly relevant and timely. Abolitionism 101. Who, where, how, why? In thinking about abolitionism, we might begin with a very basic question. Wasn't slavery going to end anyway? More than a century after slavery's global demise, it is easy to take abolition for granted. For a good part of the 20th century, both popular writers and mainstream American historians saw abolitionists as a nuisance more than anything. For them, slavery's demise flowed from big economic shifts, particularly the rise of free labor regimes that made bondage inefficient. In the United States, lost cause scholars also argued that Southern masters were benevolent and likely would have allowed slavery to perish had not maniacal abolitionists pushed them to disunion and civil war. Disturbingly, this revisionist view has appeared in some 21st century guises. As Andrew Delbanco has argued, abolitionists may have meant well, but they pushed too hard and led the nation toward a ruinous war. Forgetting about the centuries of black blood that underwrote slavery in the first place, neo-revisionists wonder if abolitionist agitation was effective or worthwhile. Yet, as former slave John Sella Martin noted after the Civil War, it would be a mistake to take abolitionism for granted. "I know this," he told global reformers in Paris in 1867. "Abolition was won through the hard struggles of rebels and reformers, not granted by slaveholders and their supporters." Martin argued that enslaved people were the first abolitionists. Motivated by freedom dreams, they sought to break the chains of bondage from Saint-Domingue to the U.S. South. They gained crucial allies through time and space, fellow agitators who broadened abolition's reach and scope. But nothing came easy to abolitionists. As the world's first social movement, abolition was something new under the sun. Abolitionist ideas and actions reframed how people understood slavery, race, global freedom, and multicultural democracy. When English writer Samuel Johnson published his famous dictionary in the 1750s, there was no entry for abolition or even slavery. 80 years later, Noah Webster's American Dictionary had entries on abolition, slavery, and manumission, terms commonly used by abolitionists to raise consciousness about bondage. Emancipation, Webster's 1828 dictionary noted, was the act of setting free from slavery, servitude, subjection, or dependence entire classes of people, such as the emancipation of slaves by their proprietors or governmental abolition programs. In fact, Webster noted that slavery no longer exists in Great Britain's mainland or in the northern states of America, a reality made possible by abolitionist activism. As Ira Berlin, Stephen Hahn, and others have noted, abolition was a lengthy process, and it started when both enslaved people and their allies challenged slavery's regular standing in the Atlantic world. They had much to overcome. As recent historians have shown, slavery remained a dominant economic and political institution for much of the 19th century. From Britain to Spanish Cuba to the U.S. South, slave regimes prospered and even expanded. The British slave lobby stalled abolitionist legislation in Parliament for years. On the other side of the Atlantic, American slavery doubled in size every few decades, and the United States became the world's largest slaveholding nation by 1860, containing roughly 4 million enslaved people, or nearly twice the number in Brazil and Spanish Cuba combined. American slavery was worth more than banks and railroads combined in the antebellum era, while slave-derived crops such as cotton dominated U.S. exports and generated enormous wealth for northern insurers, banks, and trading companies. Today, the aggregated value of slavery, from enslaved people themselves to slave-derived goods, would probably exceed the worth of many top global companies, including Apple and Amazon. Even if U.S. masters embraced compensated emancipation in 1860, as did Great Britain and France earlier, the going rate for enslaved people, which exceeded $1,200 for what was known as a prime field hand by the Civil War era, would have cost nearly as much as Union expenditures during the entire Civil War. From France to Brazil, the story was much the same. Slavery brought wealth to nations, cities, and people. It also brought untold and unfathomable misery to enslaved people everywhere. a world without abolitionists demanding change would have been very different indeed. So, who was an abolitionist? A transatlantic cause, abolitionism was less a single movement and more a series of allied struggles that coalesced around slavery's destruction. The award-winning scholar Manisha Sinha has recently written that anyone who aided the slaves' cause was a kindred spirit, a generous definition many abolitionists would support. But as the movement expanded, some abolitionists, particularly black people, argued that reformers had to fight equally hard for racial justice. Strategic discussions over black equality often divided abolitionism, making clear that not all activists saw the movement in precisely the same way. Defining just who was an abolitionist and who made the most difference can be tricky. Who was more important, emancipating statesmen like Lincoln or slave rebels in Saint-Domingue? Both presided over massive emancipations in the Atlantic world. Neither belonged to formal anti-slavery organizations. Were those who did belong to formal abolition societies less important than Lincoln or slave rebels? While these are difficult questions, they remind us that abolitionism was a continuum of activists and reformers. Movements by their nature are diverse and require diverse types of agitators to succeed. I define an abolitionist as any person, group, or political party for which slavery's destruction became the central aim. Merely thinking about slavery could be defined as the start of an abolitionist journey. But the commitment to ending bondage truly made someone an abolitionist. And that meant that statesmen, rebels, and reformers all had a place in the movement. Abolitionists joined the movement for many reasons. Enslaved people and free blacks struggled for personal liberty, while their allies were motivated by religious, humanitarian, and/or social values. Some abolitionists believed in biblical commands to aid the least among us, while others were humanitarians inspired by new rights-related discourses that appeared in the Enlightenment era and the Age of Revolution. Where previously it had been rare for people to sympathize with the plight of others, by the early 1800s, it was not strange to see reformers who worried about suffering humanity. A change in human perception, as several scholars have noted, allowed humans to see each other as essentially equals, and thus committed to the collective betterment of society. Abolitionism was also part and parcel of a major communications revolution that allowed ever more people to learn about and join the burgeoning movement. From slave narratives that uncovered the terrible truth behind bondage to anti-slavery newspapers that discussed the movement's goals and ideas, abolitionists utilized media in stunningly modern ways. They were ahead of their time. Abolitionists and human rights. Whatever motivated them to join the struggle, abolitionists across time and space returned to a core principle of democratic modernity. People could not be treated as things. What is slavery? A British abolitionist asked in 1846. It was not unfair economic relationships, the reduction of political privileges, or even restraints on freedom, problematic though these things were. If that were true, the very idea of government, family, and work would be enslavement. Rather, Atlantic bondage was a formal legal condition that turned persons into things. Enslaving men and women is reducing them to articles of property. That is slavery's intrinsic, unchanging element. This meant that masters were not robbing a man of his privileges, but of himself. Slaves were bartered, leased, mortgaged, bequeathed, invoiced, shipped, all out in the open, and with the support of law. Even children and grandparents became chattel or movable property. Harriet Jacobs, whose path-breaking autobiography, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, 1861, uncovered the particular horrors that female slaves endured, wrote that her master told me I was his property, that I must be subject to his will in all things, including sexual domination. My soul revolted against the mean tyranny, but where could I turn for protection? She realized that every black person she knew, from enslaved children to grandparents, was treated as property. That was a horrifying thought. Securing bodily freedom was thus at the top of abolitionists' agenda. Abolitionists also ushered in new concepts of human rights that extended understandings of freedom and equality. For once slaves had been liberated, abolitionists asserted they were to be made persons before the law, meaning that they had common claims to political rights, civic personhood, and protection under the law. Slaveholders denied each of these things to enslaved people, thus nullifying an essential part of democracy itself. The claim to hold property in man destroys the very idea of right, and thus rights, William Lloyd Garrison noted before the Civil War. In fact, the concept of human property exterminates human society. Slavery was modern democracy's enemy. There was no such thing as human rights as long as slavery persisted. In routing French masters, Haitian slave rebels claimed the rights of revolution and constitution-making. They then founded a nation whose constitution banned bondage forever. For abolitionists, human rights were universal and could never be relinquished. We hold human rights to be inalienable, a black abolitionist asserted in a remarkable article from the Colored American in 1837. Because moral qualities are indelible, because the human soul is immortal. Indeed, we claim them not as rich men or as poor men, not as learned or unlearned men, not as men of property and standing. Rather, he said in conclusion, we claim them on the ground of our common human nature, not because we are Americans or Europeans or Asians or Africans, but because we are human beings. Movements for political and social change necessarily focus on key concepts to gain public support: rights and liberties, justice, freedom from oppression. The abolitionist cause was successful precisely because it mobilized people across time and space on behalf of these core principles. A century apart, British reformer Thomas Clarkson and Brazilian abolitionist Joaquim Nabuco agreed that slavery violated the essential tenets of modernity and that enslaved people had human rights. Yet, as recent scholars have reminded us, social movements also elide alternate ideas about liberty. One cultural corollary to abolitionism was the focus on the educational and cultural uplift of former slaves in Western society, the idea that they needed to be lifted not only out of bondage, but also from a degraded status. That language framed black freedom as a potential problem. If African people did not meet the norms of civilizing Western nations, emancipation might fail. Ibram X. Kendi has called this uplift suasion, and he reminds us that it reflected the dominant society's values, while overlooking former enslaved people's concerns with power and autonomy. Similarly, James Sweet has noted that Atlantic dissidents like Domingos Alvarez, an African man who liberated himself from bondage in colonial Brazil in 1739 and dedicated his life to healing others from the pain of slavery, were unconcerned with economic or cultural uplift. It is a good reminder for anyone studying the abolitionist movement. Indeed, we should not romanticize abolitionists. They were fallible human beings who aimed high, but often fell short of their own lofty goals. They also stumbled on issues relating to race, gender, politics, and leadership. Black activists criticized white reformers as racially insensitive. Women protested men's myopia in not supporting their egalitarian struggles. And runaway slaves and kidnapped free blacks often defended their right to use violent tactics when others argued that all race reformers should embrace pacifism. Like many reformers, abolitionists, black as well as white, could be preachy, self-righteous, and dramatic. The image of the suffering and often insufferable saint has some merit. Abolitionism agitators and the triumph of reform. Yet it is equally important to remember that abolitionists helped take down the pain-making institution of slavery, thereby allowing Atlantic people to focus on other issues like equality and civil rights. There could be no civil rights movement, the historian James Oakes had trenchantly argued, until there was no more slavery. Like Douglass, Oakes asks that we never forget what abolitionists were up against or what they accomplished. Take the domestic slave trade in the United States, a highly profitable business that abolitionists tried to stop for decades. Even in Washington, D.C., one could see slave coffles throughout the early 1800s. Think about it. Near the present-day National Museum of African American History and Culture, people of African descent were legally and publicly bought and sold. One would think that slavery and the slave trade were the last things to have in the capital of a boasted free nation. One abolitionist handbill angrily commented. But there they are. In 1817, abolitionist Jesse Torrey made that outrage visible to people who might never get to Washington. The irony of that fact and the anger it aroused was movingly conveyed in his engraving of a coffle of enslaved people passing by the Capitol building. Finally, in 1850, abolitionist campaigns convinced Congress to eradicate the slave trade in Washington. It was a small but crucial step on the road to full freedom. This is precisely what generations of abolitionists did: fight against the injustice of slavery and racial oppression. We can never know enough about their struggles to change an ugly and painful world. Chapter 1. Early Abolitionism. Prophets versus Prophets. Who was the first abolitionist? Well before an organized abolitionist movement took shape in the 18th century, some brave person challenged slavery. We know that because slavers themselves discussed the resistance of captives. Perhaps the first abolitionist was a slave rebel in the earliest years of the Middle Passage. Perhaps it was someone who evaded capture along the West African coast. The first abolitionist may have been Native American. No sooner had imperial slavery taken shape in the Americas than indigenous people challenged bondage. Spain's earliest colonial ventures in both the Caribbean and South America targeted native people as would-be slaves, provoking fierce opposition. Their resistance struck religious dissidents like Bartolomé de las Casas, a Spanish monk who published scathing rebukes of native enslavement in the 16th century. By the 1670s, Spanish monarchs issued abolition decrees in Chile and Peru, undercutting native bondage. The great Quaker abolitionist Anthony Benezet much admired de las Casas, modeling his activism on the monk's efforts. Benezet was also inspired by African battles against enslavement. As Europeans turned from native to African labor, he and others noted, black resistance followed. Among the first documented slave rebellions was a 1522 uprising of captive Africans in the Spanish Caribbean. A century before the landing of 20 Africans in Virginia, slave resistance was already etched into the historical record. Slave resistance shadowed the expansion of Atlantic slavery. Surveying records from roughly 36,000 voyages, scholars now estimate that roughly 10% of slave-trading vessels experienced a revolt. African resistance increased the cost of slaving voyages by requiring more crew members and costlier insurance, thus cutting into profits. This reduced the overall number of transatlantic voyages and prevented the potential enslavement of several 100,000 people. Thus, while we may never know their names, the first global abolitionists were enslaved people who struggled against a new and more intractable form of human bondage. Slavery's prophets versus abolitionist prophets. African people inspired wider attacks on Atlantic bondage. Motivated by religious beliefs, including biblical injunctions to obey the Golden Rule and avoid man-stealing, these new allies of enslaved people helped put abolition on the Atlantic world's political and cultural radar during the late 1600s and early 1700s. Soon, the first formal abolition societies appeared in London, Philadelphia, and Paris, and anti-slavery networks connected activists from the Caribbean to West Africa to North America. No matter where abolitionists appeared, they had to overcome the accumulated weight of pro-slavery theology, economics, and politics. In a famous book, historian David Bryan Davis argued that abolitionists were up against a system of economic and psychological mastery with ancient roots as well as modern cachet. Unfree labor systems proliferated from ancient Rome to Africa, and Christianity, Judaism, and Islam offered theological rationales for the enslavement of non-believers, debtors, and war captives, just slaves. On the philosophical front, notable thinkers from Plato and Aristotle onward had sanctioned classic slavery. Yet abolitionists also squared off against a new type of bondage in early modern society. As European empires built New World economies based on mining wealth, including gold and silver in the Caribbean and South America, and much-desired cash crops, sugar, coffee, indigo, rice, cotton, tobacco, they created massive labor needs. Neither indentured servants from Europe nor indigenous people could keep pace. In turning to captive African labor, imperial masters transformed slavery itself into a terrible institution of near-complete human domination. Indeed, slavery shifted drastically in size and scope. Though a pan-African slave trade had operated for centuries, with Muslim and Arab traders transferring several million people from Central and West African locales to the Middle East and Mediterranean Europe, the transatlantic slave trade created an even bigger forced population transfer. Between the 1400s and the late 1800s, approximately 12 to 15 million people of African descent endured the Middle Passage. Portuguese traders brought captive Africans into Lisbon well before Christopher Columbus's famous voyages. After the Spanish joined the fray, transatlantic slaving ventures heralded a lucrative future for European nations. Soon, British, French, Dutch, American, and even Scandinavian nations participated in the international slave trade. New World slavery spread across a vast geographical terrain. The overwhelming majority of enslaved people went to South American and Caribbean locales. A much smaller number arrived in North America. Wherever captives went, they followed the insatiable demands of a rising international market for slave-derived commodities. Unlike traditional bondage, New World slavery was very much an economic affair. Unlike classic bondage, too, New World slavery became linked exclusively to race. Racialized slavery did not appear immediately, and there were variations among imperial regimes. Still, New World masters increasingly tagged people of African descent as slaves. During the 1660s, colonial assemblies in Virginia and Maryland linked slave status to African or Black people. This racial marker allowed masters to better control servile populations. Race further redefined New World slavery by making bondage perpetual through a person's bloodline. In classic slaving systems, bondage stopped at one's death. Now, it devolved to one's children, their children's children, and so on, until a formal legal document known as manumission liberated enslaved people. New World enslavers went to such lengths for one very simple reason. Slavery was a money-making machine. From the colonial American South to the Caribbean, slaves produced enormous wealth for masters and investors alike. Tobacco saved the earliest Virginia settlements from disaster, while rice plantations generated tremendous fortunes for South Carolina gentlemen. The French colony of Saint-Domingue was known as the Pearl of the Antilles for its lucrative sugar plantations. By the 1780s, the
Sample complete. Ready to continue?